Hey everyone, my name's Isaac Santos, and I'm here in Pine Creek Wilderness, a rugged, lesser traveled area of Cleveland National Forest. I chose this place for my RTM 305 research project because I wanted to experience a truly wild landscape that examines how land, history, and recreation intersect. For some scenic description around me, as you can see, it's very cloudy, but the air is dry yet clean. I could smell the sagebrush and oak around me. The trail was crunching beneath my feet as I was walking up to record this video. I was also able to hear some birds chirp overhead and the wind rustling through the chaparral. This place feels still, yet I know it's alive. I could hear my own breath and my footsteps and the wilderness around me. Some history of the land. This land used to be home to the Kumeyaay people long before it was a wilderness designation in 1984. They gathered acorns, hunted, and practiced spiritual rituals connected to the land, yet today those stories are rarely told in official materials. Their erasure reflects a broader issue in land interpretation. Some land controversies. Pine Creek Wilderness has faced tensions between use and preservation. Historically, cattle grazing, resource extraction altered the land today. Today, fire management, illegal use, and public access debates continue. These controversies shape how this land is managed and who gets to enjoy it. The land management approach. Here in Pine Creek Wilderness, the U.S. Forest Service manages Pine Creek Wilderness with a hands-off approach under the Wilderness Act of 1964. The goal is to let nature shape itself, no permanent structures, no mechanized access. It's meant to protect its wild character, but also limits accessibility. Landscape. Pine Creek Wilderness sits at an ecological crossroad, combining coastal shrub, oak woodland, and conifer groves. The mix of elevation and vegetation supports a wide range of wildlife. Compared to nearby wilderness areas, it's quieter, drier, and less trafficked, offering a more raw experience. Some recreation opportunities here. Activities here include horseback riding, hiking, birding, and dispersed camping. No developed facilities are present, no restrooms, no water. The experience is meant to be immersive and self reliant. Some things that you can't do here is anything with a motorized engine, so that includes no biking or no e bikes. As for visitor use and restrictions, visitor use is low, trail maintenance is minimal, and signage is sparse. Access is limited to a few trailhead. These restrictions protect the land, but also unintentionally restrict areas for newcomers or marginalized communities. Who recreates here and who doesn't? Based on my research and observation, most users are white, older, and have experience in outdoor recreation. Barriers like transportation, cultural exclusion, and safety concerns prevent many people, especially from BIPOC communities, from feeling welcome or included here. Interpretation and bias. Most of the interpretation here comes from a white Western conservation lens, one that emphasizes solitude, untouched land, and ruggedness. Indigenous voices are rarely centered. Official materials tend to ignore the colonial past and exclude non-traditional narratives of the land. My time here in Pine Creek Wilderness has shifted my perspective on wilderness, as it's not just nature. It's a reflection of our values, our histories, and our responsibility. As a student and future recreation professional, I see the importance of asking the question, what's presented to listen to, what's missing, and what to work towards. Thank you. After spending time in Pine Creek Wilderness and forming my own impressions, I wanted to understand what happens behind the scenes, how the space is managed, what challenges exist, and how decisions are made. So I followed up my visit with an interview with Marianne Daliva, the wilderness coordinator and Brandon Nearest, Acting Recreation Lands Officer with the U.S. Forest Service. Speaking with them really deepened my understanding of what it means to manage a wilderness area in practice. One of my biggest takeaways was how deeply the Wilderness Act of 1964 shapes everything. Marianne emphasized that nearly every decision they make, whether it's about signage, visitor use, or trail work, is rooted in that law. There's a real commitment to keeping the land untrammeled, which means as natural and self-sustaining as possible. That value was visible during my visit, but I didn't fully realize how structured and performance-based their management systems are. They use tools like solitude monitoring, visitor tracking, and internal checklists to stay aligned with the legal and ecological goals of wilderness. Another key insight that came from our conversation about conflict and land pressure, while Pine Creek doesn't have the kind of high-profile controversies we studied in the ANWR case, it still faces real quiet tensions. Brandon talked about unauthorized trails formed by foot traffic tied to immigration, wildfire risk, and even a feral hog invasion that impacted endangered species habitats. There aren't traditional conflicts, but they show that wilderness management is about constant adaptation to human and ecological impact, even in places that seem remote or untouched. I also asked about visitor demographics and access. Their data surprised me. While the area sees diverse visitors anecdotally due to its proximity to the city, actual Forest Service data shows that about 90% of visitors are white and about 60% are male. That statistic really made me think about who feels welcomed in wilderness areas and who's being unintentionally excluded, whether through lack of outreach, cultural disconnect, or limited signage and trail infrastructure. And finally, we talked about interpretation, how the story of Pine Creek is told. Marianne acknowledged that while some signage is being updated, the history and presence of the Kumeyaay people are still not well represented. That stood out to me during my visit, and hearing it confirmed and reinforced how much work is still needed to tell a fuller, more inclusive story of this land. Overall, conducting the interview after my visit helped me connect with what I saw with the larger systems I worked. It reminded me that wilderness is never just wild, it's managed, monitored, and shaped by values. And those values determine who benefits, whose histories are visible, and how we move forward. As a future recreation professional, I know now that protecting nature isn't just about minimizing impact. It's about expanding inclusion and questioning whose version of wilderness we're preserving. Hello again, and in this section of my RTM 305 project, I'm going to reflect on the wilderness conflict we studied in class, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, or ANWR, and how it relates to my research project at Pine Creek Wilderness. I'll explore key issues in both locations, analyzing stakeholder interests, assess how these areas are managed under the Wilderness Act, and share my own perspective on how my thoughts have evolved through this process. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge has long stood at the center of high-stake conflict over land use in America. At the heart of the debate is whether to allow oil drilling in its coastal plain. Advocates for drilling include oil companies and certain politicians argue that it will boost economic development, contribute to U.S. energy independence, and create jobs. On the opposing side are environmental scientists and indigenous groups, particularly the Gwinnett Nation, who view the land as sacred and essential to biodiversity and cultural survival. The Gwinnett consider the porcupine caribou herd that calves in ANWR a keystone species, not just ecologically, but spiritually and nutritionally. They fear that drilling would damage this delicate ecosystem and their way of life. Interesting, not all indigenous voices are aligned. Some Inupiat communities support drilling due to the potential revenue sharing and economic development. This illustrates the diversity within indigenous perspectives and remind us that sovereignty and conservation don't always perfectly align. Learning this complexity gave me a deeper understanding of how wilderness areas are contested spaces, shaped not just by environmental concerns but by identity, power, and the economy. This understanding influenced how I approach Pine Creek, looking beyond the surface to uncover the subtle dynamics at play. At Pine Creek Wilderness, the stakes are less dramatic, but the dynamics are familiar. The main stakeholders include the U.S. Forest Service, experienced recreational users, local volunteers, and theoretically the broader public. In practice, though, management decisions are often shaped by internal frameworks and legal mandates rather than inclusive community engagement. During my visit and follow-up interview with a land manager, I learned that wilderness character monitoring and visitor tracking are key tools used to uphold that hands-off approach preservation model under the Wilderness Act. However, what's missing is an intentional effort to include diverse narratives and users in the stewardship process. Indigenous histories, specifically those of the Kumeyaay, are largely absent in interpretive materials. This omission reflects a form of narrative exclusion where the land is protected, but the people most connected to it are not acknowledged. This site is also not equitably accessed. Visitor observations and studies suggest that most users are white, male, and highly experienced in outdoor recreation. Without targeted outreach or programming, underrepresented communities remain marginalized. So, while there is no active drilling or protest, there is still a quieter conflict, a tension between access and the protection and inclusion of tradition. The Wilderness Act of 1964 describes wilderness as land untrammeled by man that offers opportunities for solitude and primitive recreation. It also emphasizes that these lands should be preserved for the benefit of the present and future generation. In the case of ANWR, resolving conflict means honoring both environmental integrity and cultural survival. One meaningful solution would be to establish a formal co-management structure between federal agencies and indigenous nations. Such arrangements would elevate indigenous ecological knowledge and affirm tribal sovereignty. In practice, this could mean banning drilling while allowing indigenous stewardship and traditional use. This approach aligns with both the Wilderness Act and indigenous frameworks. This model is also applicable to Pine Creek, engaging the Kumeyaay in educational programming. Land interpretation and decision-making would help bridge the gap between policy and justice. It would shift wilderness management from a purely ecological mission to a cultural inclusive one. Legally speaking, Pine Creek adheres to the core tenets of the Wilderness Act. There are no roads, no mechanized use, and very little development. The land is quiet, biologically diverse, and largely untouched. But when we look at the broader mission to protect wilderness for the American people, the site falls short. The lack of interpretive signage, the absence of diverse cultural narratives, and the limited accessibility all suggest that this space is not fully serving its intended public. As I learned during my interviews, there are no current active effort to engage new or marginalized visitors. Without this engagement, we risk protecting land for narrow audiences, which contradicts the spirit of shared national stewardship. That said, Pine Creek absolutely embodies the therapeutic essence I associate with wilderness. Its stillness, its rawness, and its ability to make you feel small in the best way, all supports solitude, introspection, and emotional reset. For me, this space was a retreat from the demands of everyday life, in the quiet pockets of the forest. I felt more connected to myself, the land, and the wider web of life. Wilderness, when held with care and respect, is a place where healing becomes possible. Did my perspective change? Yes, profoundly. Initially, I saw ANWR as an extreme case and assumed that more localized wilderness areas like Pine Creek were relatively apolitical. But visiting the site, conducting a field interview, and reflecting on management structures helped me realize that even places without visible controversies are shaped by decisions about inclusion, recognition, and representation. My time in Pine Creek made me recognize how wilderness can be political without being visibly contentious. The policies, who gets to access the land, whose stories are told, these are deeply political decisions. It pushed me to reevaluate how I define conflict in the context of wilderness. Silence doesn't mean neutrality, it can mean exclusion, and that's something I wasn't fully aware of until this experience. On a personal level, I also experienced a deep emotional shift. Being in Pine Creek helped me understand wilderness not just as a subject of academic interest, but as a lived, felt experience. I realized how essential these spaces are for mental clarity, stress relief, and grounding. As a student and part-time worker constantly immersed in deadlines, noise, and social obligations, Pine Creek gave me the rare opportunity to reset. The quiet and solitude reminded me that healing doesn't always have to come from conversation. It can come from stillness. That experience changed how I view the value of wilderness. Not just something to protect for biodiversity, but something to protect for human wellness. It's therapy, it's sanctuary, and it's a mirror we hold up to ourselves. Three core texts deeply influenced my understanding of wilderness during this project. William Cronin's Trouble with the Wilderness, Roderick Nash, Wilderness and the American Mind, and Section 2C of the Wilderness Act. Together they reveal that wilderness is not just a physical place, it's an idea, a construct, and in many ways, a mirror of American cultural values. In Trouble with the Wilderness, Cronin makes a bold argument that we've come to define and value wilderness as pristine, untouched, and separate from humans is not only historically inaccurate but also ethically problematic. He points out that this romanticized view of nature erases indigenous presence and stewardship. It promotes a narrative where only lands that appear empty are worth protecting, which often leads to disposition of the very people who have the deepest cultural and ecological ties to it. This was clear to me in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge conflict. The Greenwich people, whose lives and culture are intimately tied to the porcupine caribou herd, have to fight to be recognized, not just as stakeholders but as sovereign stewards of their own land. Meanwhile, the policy framework surrounding ANWR often treats this area as if it was uninhabited, wild, in the colonial sense of the word. I saw a quieter but related version of this tension at Pine Creek. The area is managed according to the federal standards of minimal impact, which is important for ecological protection, but there's almost no acknowledgement of the Kumeyaay Nation and their history and ongoing relationship with the land. As Cronin argues, if our definition of wilderness depends on the absence of humans, it becomes difficult to include indigenous people whose lifeways are rooted in respectful, sustainable land use. In this way, the very policies that aim to protect wilderness can end up perpetuating exclusion. Section 2C of the Wilderness Act reinforces this dilemma. It defines wilderness as land untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. This language was revolutionary in 1964, finally granting legal protection to lands against development and mechanization. But it also reflects a specific cultural perspective: the settler colonial idea that true nature exists only where human influence is absent. For many indigenous communities, that premise is not just false, it's deeply harmful. They do not see themselves as separate from nature, but as a part of it. The idea that their ancestral homelands must be empty to qualify as wilderness delegitimizes their presence and erases their history. Roderick Nash, Wilderness and the American Mind, adds another layer to this analysis. Nash traces how Americans' relationships with wilderness evolved from fear and conquest to reverence and protection. He shows how wilderness becomes a symbol of national identity, tied to the ideas of rugged individualism, masculinity, and the frontier spirit. But this romanticization of wilderness often came at the cost of reality. The version of nature that gets protected tends to be the ones that fits a certain aesthetic: vast, dramatic, untouched. It's not a coincidence that places like Yosemite and Yellowstone were designated as national treasures, while culturally rich but less visually epic landscapes were ignored and exploited. Nash's work helped me realize that both AMWR and Pine Creek reflect these cultural blind spots. In both cases, decisions about land use and preservation are still shaped by outdated narratives, ones that prioritize ecological purity over cultural inclusion, and settler perspectives over indigenous voices. Even when we act with good intentions, we often reproduce the same dynamics of control and exclusion that the Wilderness Act was supposed to push back against. These readings collectively challenge us to imagine a different future for wilderness, one that is relational, inclusive, and honest about its history. Cronin encourages us to stop seeing wilderness as a museum of untouched nature and start seeing it as a lived and living landscape. Nash shows us how cultural values influence what we protect and why. And the Wilderness Act, while monumental, also invites reinterpretation. Its purpose to preserve wilderness for the benefit of present and future generations can and should include more diverse voices, histories, and ways of knowing. Ultimately, this project taught me that protecting wilderness is not just a legal or environmental task, it's a cultural and ethical one. It's about rethinking who belongs in wilderness, whose stories are told, and what kinds of relationships we honor between people and place. Wilderness is not a static idea, it can grow. And if we want it to be truly just, truly restorative, and truly reflective of the people who live and love these places, we have to be willing to rewrite the story.